Welcome to FIA Expo. I'm Walt Luke, and I want to thank you for being a part of the FIA community. While it's unfortunate we're not able to gather in person right now, FIA is committed to bringing you an engaging 3 days of thought leadership on the topics that matter most to you. I want to start by recognizing our veterans from this industry who have served their country and sacrificed for all of us. Tomorrow marks the day we recognize our veterans, and we are truly grateful for your service that has brought us our freedom. What I most appreciate about the FI community is it feels like a family. Like all families, this industry argues with each other, competes vigorously, plays hard, and at times acts a bit dysfunctional. But when push comes to shove, I would put this industry up against any, because when it matters most, we come together. What a chaotic year it has been. Who would have thought a year ago that we would experience a global pandemic, an ensuing economic shutdown, a highly contentious US election, social injustice and unrest, the UK and Europe still quibbling over their divorce, and several major natural disasters tied to climate change. For many of us, 2020 cannot be over soon enough. But adversity causes you to grow, to learn, and adapt. And here's what I've learned over the past 6 months. First off, it turns out I actually like my family. And oddly enough, they like me back. Who knew? Secondly, I didn't realize how important watching sports is to my existence and happiness. During the early days of the lockdown, I found myself watching any sport, from professional cornhole to Canadian curling to Korean baseball. Thank goodness the major sports are back, including the Masters this week. Go Tiger, and importantly, go Indiana Hoosier football. And lastly, I realized how much I appreciate and miss seeing the people of this industry and how they came together during the crisis to ensure our markets were up and running. The term resilience is thrown around a lot to describe our industry, but it's important to understand what goes into becoming resilient. Resilience doesn't just happen, it's earned. Our industry has worked tirelessly over the years to make sure our markets function safely in good times and in bad. Since the financial crisis of 2008, our community has engaged with the regulatory authorities to strengthen rules, to probe assumptions, to game theory worst-case scenarios, and to test our readiness. But the improvements put into place over the last decade had not been tested. That is, until last spring, when extreme market volatility provided a real-world stress test. The good news is that the markets proved themselves robust. In spite of the extreme market volatility and turmoil, there was no collapse of confidence. There was no breakdown in the clearing system, and the markets remained open and fully functioning throughout. The resilience was achieved in large part by the good work of market participants and regulators working together long hours to keep the markets open. You all should be applauded. That said, we would be remiss as a community not to reflect on the spring volatility to see if there are lessons learned. FIA members have been meeting since March to review ways to improve the resilience of the clearing system, including analyzing end-of-day settlements, allocations, trade breaks, just to name a few. FIA is working with firms and exchanges to improve and automate processes and standards so we are prepared for the next period of volatility. FIA also analyzed the margin system and how it functioned during the March volatility. To help bring transparency to this topic, FIA recently launched a CCP tracker tool on its website that publishes public data and visuals on margin levels, default funds, and other CCP waterfall information. Additionally, FIA recently published a white paper that uses public and private data to examine the increases in initial margin at derivatives clearinghouses during the March timeframe. While margin increases are expected during volatile times, we must make sure that margin levels are calibrated to be predictable and not overly procyclical to cause undue stress during times of market turbulence. FIA's paper makes several suggestions and aims to promote an important dialogue within the industry and regulatory community on whether improvements can be made. And I'm happy to say there are Expo panels this week that will explore these lessons from the spring. There's a saying that to know where you are going, you must know where you have been. Our industry's past is rooted in agriculture and helping farmers and ranchers manage risk and discover prices. Farmers and ranchers are resourceful people whose livelihood is based on both understanding markets and being good caretakers of the earth. These are not mutually exclusive concepts. I'm reminded of my former boss, the late Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, who owned a 600-acre corn and soybean farm southwest of Indianapolis. The senator was most proud of his farm's 60-acre grove of black walnut trees, which he registered in 2006 as the first tree farm to provide a carbon offset with the Chicago Climate Exchange. As a farmer, the pragmatic Lugar loved the idea that his walnut trees would help his stewardship of the earth. And the notoriously frugal senator didn't mind that he got paid to do it. Lugar well understood that incentives and markets matter in our battle to make a more sustainable world. It's difficult to dispute that climate-related disasters are occurring on a more frequent basis. Over the last 2 years, global losses caused by natural catastrophes amounted to a record $640 billion annually. For an industry obsessed with data, there is a significant body of evidence that climate risk is a growing threat to the global economy. Market-based solutions are an important component to unlocking this problem. I've seen time and time again how this industry takes uncertainty and turns it into opportunity. It was our industry that created foreign currency and financial futures when the world went off the gold standard in the 1970s. It was our industry that brought us electronic and cross-border trading that democratized our markets around the globe. And yes, it was our industry that brought us markets to help clean up the acid rain problem in America, and that listed carbon and more recently water for the first time on a trading platform. FIA recently published a policy paper entitled How Derivatives Markets Are Helping the World Fight Climate Change. The paper highlights existing industry solutions and potential partnerships with the public sector to help build a more sustainable economy. FIA is also taking part in a task force on improving voluntary carbon markets under the sponsorship of former Bank of England Governor Mark Carney, now Special Envoy for Climate Action at the UN. This task force published its interim report for public comment today, and I encourage our members to provide comment over the next month to this important document. There is no silver bullet, but we need to be creative on the ways to address the problem. And at FIA, we believe that markets should be at the center of any solution. And I'm proud to be a member of an industry that has stepped up to these kinds of challenges in the past and faced them head on. I'll conclude by saying how excited I am by the Expo program ahead. You'll hear from one of the world's top infectious disease experts, Dr. Kathy Newsel, about the state of the COVID outbreak and the race to develop a vaccine. We're thrilled to have forward-thinking technology journalist and frequent CNBC commentator Kara Swisher. And Expo wouldn't be Expo without thought leaders like CFTC Chairman Heath Tarbert, who's appearing next, SEC Commissioner Hester Peirce, and one-on-one interviews with our global exchange leaders. I also hope you will stop by our Innovators Pavilion to help us determine the 2020 Innovator of the Year. As many of you know, charitable giving is always a big part of FIA's events, especially this year. FIA is proud to continue its support of the Greater Chicago Food Depository. FIA will match individual donations up to $15,000 to this great organization. And I'm proud to have already personally contributed towards this goal. Please join the Futures Fights Hunger campaign by simply texting FIA to 91999 for donation details. Most importantly, I want to thank our sponsors and exhibitors that make all of this possible. I personally appreciate your support for our industry, especially during this time. Expo has always been a time that our community comes together to debate and shape the future of our industry. This week also marks the start of a transition with the election of Joe Biden as the next president of the United States. Our thoughts and prayers go out to President-elect Biden during this time as he puts together his team to lead our nation. And our industry looks forward to working with his administration on ways to strengthen our markets in the coming months. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage someone who needs no introduction, CFTC Chairman Heath Tarbert. Chairman Tarbert has been leading an ambitious agenda over the last year that includes strengthening the rules for the global markets, finalizing Dodd-Frank regulations, negotiating international cooperation agreements, and revamping the CFTC's mission and organizational design, just to name a few. Ladies and gentlemen, we are pleased to have Chairman Tarbert kick off our Expo program. Mr. Chairman, the stage is all yours.
Well, good morning, everyone. And first, I want to thank you, Walt, and I want to thank FIA for inviting me back to this really important gathering of derivatives industry participants. I hope that everyone is staying safe, and I hope that we can all be together soon. Well, when we were here at the 2019 Expo, and boy, that feels like 5 years ago, doesn't it? I laid out a mission and vision for the CFTC. Our mission is to promote the integrity, resilience, and vibrancy of U.S. derivatives markets through sound regulation. Our vision is to be the global standard for sound derivatives regulation. And back in 2019, in a large room with other people, with many of you, I laid out a plan for what the agency would do in the coming year. I spent the first 100 days of my term talking to external stakeholders, getting to know the agency, and laying out my plan. That plan set out 5 goals of my administration and laid out specific action items to fulfill each of those goals. Well, as the great military strategist Helmut von Moltke said, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Or perhaps better, as Mike Tyson said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And boy, 2020 sure punched us and the entire world right in the mouth. 2020 was a huge test of resiliency of our markets, of our market participants, and of our agency. And I'm so proud to say that all 3 showed how tough they are. So what have we been up to in 2020? Well, I showed everybody last year what the plan was. But a plan is only a piece of paper unless it's executed. Like Thomas Edison said, vision without execution is hallucination. Now, this industry has seen big talk before. And what we needed to prove is that we could walk that talk. And to go back to the roots and the hoofs of the futures industry, we needed to show that we weren't all sizzle and no steak. So you saw that plan and were asking me last year and are asking me, where's the beef? Well, since last Expo, the agency had 19 open meetings. That's more open meetings than the prior 7 years combined before me getting to the agency. And 11 of those meetings were after the COVID pandemic started. And we just didn't have these meetings so we could talk about the weather. The agency approved 30 final rules and proposed more that I hope we'll finalize by the end of this year. And 22 of those final rules were done during COVID. This includes finishing all the major Dodd-Frank rulemakings. We may visit and revisit and recalibrate some of these final rules, but from here on, we're moving from building the system to improving the system. And there were other things we accomplished as well that I'll talk about a little later. When I was laying out my plan for the agency, I focused on 5 key goals that have since been adopted by our 5-member commission. The first was to strengthen the resiliency and integrity of our derivatives markets while fostering their vibrancy. The second is to regulate the derivatives markets to promote the interest of all Americans. The third, to encourage innovation and enhance the experience for market participants like so many of you at home and abroad. The fourth was to be tough on those who break the rules. And finally, we wanted to focus on our unique mission and improve our operational effectiveness as an agency. Well, the amazing thing is that this agency has advanced each of these goals during the past year. In short, we've gone from goals to action. Our markets are incredibly important to the American and the world economy. They have to function well in good times and be able to withstand the bad times as well. The vital role of the CFTC is to ensure those markets are both vibrant but also resilient. But global oversight and cooperation of regulators since the 2008 financial crisis still lacked a clear framework when I took the helm of the agency. When I started at the CFTC, the US and European regulators were grappling with the fallout from Brexit. In particular, the EU wanted to make sure it had enough oversight of clearing once London left the EU. But American clearinghouses stood to be collateral damage from that fight. We needed to find a way for both sides of the Atlantic to oversee clearinghouses that are relevant to them without creating unwieldy and overlapping oversight. Well, I'm pleased to say that our negotiations bore fruit, both on the specific issue of clearinghouses, as well as creating the most productive working relationship ever between the CFTC and the European Union. So what are the concrete results? Well, here's a place with a lot of stake to go with the sizzle. The EU revamped EMIR 2.2 and didn't designate any US clearinghouse as Tier 2. So our clearinghouses, including the CME, remain under the sole oversight of the CFTC. At the same time, we've revamped our rules to provide alternative compliance for certain non-US clearinghouses. This allows derivatives clearing organizations incorporated outside the US that don't pose a substantial risk to our country to meet their regulatory obligations through compliance with their home country's rules. So we're avoiding duplicative supervision of clearinghouses, which can exacerbate problems in the event of defaults. But at the end of the day, we've amicably worked out a solid solution. We've enshrined that through sound regulations and memorialized plans for enhanced cooperation through an MOU with ESMA to share information about our clearinghouses. At the end of this process, I think we've ushered in a new era of productive transatlantic cooperation. But our work on clearinghouses isn't the only thing we've done to strengthen the resiliency of our markets. We finalized rules on swap dealer capital requirements, so our dealers who have been provisionally registered for over 7 years can finally drop that provisional tag. And we finalized a rule, not guidance, on the treatment of cross-border swaps, a rule that clears up much of the confusion generated by the early flurry of Dodd-Frank rulemakings, and that properly focuses the CFTC's jurisdiction on risks that can wash back onto American shores. Finally, we revamped our swaps reporting rules to harmonize them with other regulators and to make sure the agency can fully quantify and analyze risk in the cleared and uncleared swaps markets. We've also done a lot to promote the interest of all Americans. Most Americans have never heard of the CFTC, but our agency and the actions we've taken over the past year has had a big impact on the pocketbook issues for most American families, like the price of food at the store, gas at the pump, and interest rates on people's home mortgages, and where we've come through for everyday Americans with both our position limits rule and our work on the LIBOR transition. Well, if our work on cross-border clearing was a steak, position limits was a brisket. It's huge, it's a tough cut of meat if you don't get it right, and it takes a hell of a long time to get it done. But you know what? Once it's done, there's enough for everybody. Our position limits rule is a workable solution to what has been a long, drawn-out drama. Our proposal earlier this year was the agency's 5th attempt at a position limits rule since 2010. Only one of those rules was ever adopted as final, and it was later vacated by the district court. Every nominee for chairman or commissioner has pledged to the Senate that they would get position limits done. But until last month, no one could. We put together a framework that I think will stand the test of time. It achieves our goals of limiting the role that the speculative positions can play in our markets, while acknowledging the different ways that cash market participants use futures markets for hedging. The rule leverages the good work of our exchanges and what they're already doing to set and monitor position limits. Our goal was to make the rule as easy as possible to comply with by clearly enumerating as many hedging transactions as were warranted and creating a streamlined exchange-centric review for non-enumerated hedges. Now, my hope is that after some work and compliance systems are in place, this rule will not be a huge burden on compliance departments that the prior proposals certainly would have been. And once this rule is in effect, I think we'll have given the markets good protections against excessive levels of speculation, which some people believe cause big swings in commodity prices over the years. Another example of our rules helping everyday Americans is our work on LIBOR transition. This is a key interest rate that's been used to set rates on mortgages, commercial loans, and many other individual and corporate debts. And as we found out over the past decade, it's a rate that can be gained. The CFTC took a leading role in identifying the problems with LIBOR, and we've helped with the transition away from that rate. Now, while the CFTC didn't select SOFR as the replacement rate, we've done a lot to encourage and facilitate its replacement. We've offered targeted no-action relief to help move existing LIBOR-based swaps to SOFR and to other risk-free rates. We've also worked with our clearinghouses as they switch from LIBOR to SOFR to discount cash flows. The concerted efforts of industry and regulators through the ARC will help ensure a smooth transition, covering thousands of counterparties and trillions in notional swaps. The ARC process has been a model of public-private partnership aimed at achieving a goal that, let's face it, neither side would have been able to achieve alone. And while our attention has been focused on making sure the existing markets continue to function well, we also need to keep an eye on what's to come. Our markets are constantly evolving to address the needs of market participants. And so many of the things that are integral to our markets today, think about it, electronic trading, interest rate markets, energy derivatives, all of those things were once considered new and disruptive. Well, the CFTC is an agency that embraces change. Congress, in fact, put in our implementing statute that the agency should, quote, foster responsible innovation. As far as I can tell, the CFTC is the only agency with the word innovation in our statute. So what have we done to foster responsible innovation? Well, the first is engagement. And when I talk about engagement, I've got to talk about the role of Lab CFTC. Lab CFTC's role is twofold. First, to engage proactively with the innovator community. And second, to keep CFTC staff apprised of trends and developments in innovation. At Lab CFTC's office hours, innovators can talk to staff about developments in the industry. This lets innovators, many of whom don't have traditional financial services backgrounds, let alone regulatory backgrounds, think about how their innovation fits within the CFTC's regulations. And the lab has continued these outreach efforts even during COVID. The lab has also been instrumental in keeping CFTC staff up to date on fintech developments. In fact, since COVID started, the lab has given over 60 training sessions internally here at the CFTC. And that's one of the main ways that I myself have been able to keep up on developments in fintech. And the importance of this engagement is one of the reasons why I elevated Lab CFTC to report directly to the chairman and to be at the same level as our other major divisions at the agency. And this engagement isn't just limited to industry. In the past year, we've joined the Global Financial Innovation Network, which is a group of over 60 central banks, regulators, and organizations from around the world, creating a framework for cooperation on financial innovation. We also recently signed a statement of intent with the South African Reserve Bank to promote financial innovation. Now, I recognize the difficulty faced by many market operators about where the CFTC's jurisdiction stops and the SEC's jurisdiction begins. So I made it a point during my tenure for the two agencies to work hand in hand to resolve these issues. The two agencies have worked behind the scenes on the dividing line between CFTC and SEC jurisdiction over digital assets. And last year, based on conversations between the two agencies, I stated my position that Ether was a commodity under CFTC jurisdiction, which provided much greater certainty to the fintech community. And just last month, the two agencies, for the first time in 45 years of our shared existence, held a joint open meeting to vote on something. In this case, margin on securities futures, an issue that has been hampered the development of that market here in the US, despite the fact that it thrives overseas. Now, the dividing line between the agencies may be murky to the market, which has the unfortunate consequence of creating uncertainty for financial innovations. But I believe the cooperative relationship between the agencies, between the two commissions, and in particular, the way in which Chairman Clayton and I have fostered it through committed dialogue will help bring clarity to our markets. The second thing we've done, apart from engagement, is to provide actual guidance. We've taken all the information we've gotten from conversations with this industry and questions about how new fintech innovation fits within our regulations, and we've used that to provide solid guidance to the marketplace. So in March of this year, we published a binding commission interpretation on the actual delivery of digital assets for leveraged products, which was the culmination of 2 years of work and countless comments from and conversations with the digital asset community. The CFTC also just published a few weeks ago some very helpful guidance on how FCMs should account for physically delivered virtual currency futures. This guidance will let the industry understand how the agency views some of the most important issues around accounting and financial reporting of virtual currencies. There are still plenty of issues that we're working through with the fintech community, and I hope that we're going to continue to provide more guidance on how these products fit within our regulations. And this engagement and guidance isn't just empty talk. We're seeing a real payoff in our markets as they diversify with new products, as well as new contract markets. During my tenure, we've designated 2 new contract markets. We've amended the orders of 3 clearinghouses to handle additional products. And we have other new markets right now in discussion with our commission for future designations. We've also seen an explosion of new products offered on our exchanges. Of course, digital assets are a big focus of innovation right now. And we've seen physically delivered Bitcoin futures offered for the first time. And in just the past few months, we've seen Ether futures listed on a DCM for the first time. And this is less than a year after I stated my position that Ether is a commodity under CFTC jurisdiction. But it's not just digital assets. Our exchanges have listed over 1,000 new products, new contracts since last July, ranging from new contracts on port cuts that can provide better risk management compared to live hogs, to futures on water prices in California, to new stock index volatility futures. At the end of the day, our markets are not only resilient, they're also innovative. Well, so far, I've talked a lot about making the system more resilient, making it work for the American people, and fostering innovation. But it's not all sunshine and roses out there. Sometimes there are cattle rustlers, and that's where enforcement plays its role. 2020 was a banner year for our enforcement division, and all of you who abide by the rules should take comfort in that. Our markets depend on rules, and when somebody breaks those rules, they can undermine the confidence in our markets. So we've got to make sure that non-compliance isn't a competitive edge. So we want to do 2 things. First, we want to reward a culture of compliance for all those people out there, including many in this audience, who operate within the CFTC's regulations. So that's why we've issued additional guidance on self-reporting. The more companies have robust programs, the better they can identify and remediate compliance problems. That improves the securities of our markets and our market participants, and it's something that we should reward. Second, we've gone after people who try to operate outside the CFTC's regulations. Our statute and regulations are pretty clear about what has to be offered on a registered exchange. And so while we want to foster responsible innovation, we can't abide by people who flout our rules. But just over a month ago, the Enforcement Division brought an enormous case with the Department of Justice against a huge unregistered Bitcoins derivatives exchange. This case may turn out to be one of the biggest cases our agency's ever brought against a company that's taken over $1 billion in fees from customers, including many US customers, for unlicensed and heavily leveraged Bitcoin derivatives. Our registered exchanges comply with rules on customer protection and market integrity for the benefit of market and market participants. This platform didn't comply with those rules, and we can't reward non-compliance. It's bad for US customers, it's bad for our firms that are complying, and it's bad for the commodities markets as a whole. Similarly, we're also acting aggressively against offshore funds that either fake registration with the NFA or otherwise hide behind invalid exemptions. You know, it's really important. Many of you are NFA members, and it means something to be an NFA member. And so we can't have people effectively subverting that process. And finally, last month, we filed our joint ever case with state regulators. This case, called metals.com, involved fraudulent solicitation for precious metal derivatives that took in over $185 million from lots of retail victims, including the elderly, who were in some cases targeted because of their Christian and conservative beliefs. Well, we have covered a lot of ground in the past year, but there's a lot more we've been doing outside of rulemaking and enforcement. These have focused on our response to the COVID pandemic, as well as how the agency operates. To start, this agency in the entire world felt the pain of the COVID pandemic. Back in March, when our major cities were locked down and social distancing prevented normal operations, we worked with our market participants, with the NFA and our exchanges, to provide temporary targeted relief. Our first priority was to make sure that our markets could operate virtually as the entire industry went remote. We then actively engaged with our fellow regulators globally to monitor volatility in the markets and to look for potential weaknesses that needed to be addressed. We've been heavily involved in IOSCO committees that are tracking potential vulnerabilities. And my own service as vice chair of the IOSCO board has ensured that the CFTC has a seat at the table at all relevant international fora. We've engaged with our clearinghouses and our largest dealers and participants to monitor margin levels, liquidity, and indicators of the health of our markets. When things went south, this whole industry and regulators globally pulled together, worked together, and made sure the system held together. All the while, our agency was facing many of the same problems that our participants were. Our employees moved to telework overnight. Our technology team went into overdrive to make sure systems could handle the change. But the agency focused on the challenges of COVID and became stronger in the process. We found ways to have remote open commission meetings, and we instituted regular internal leadership calls so that everyone could stay apprised of the situation. And as you can tell from all we've done in the past year, our productivity as an agency never went down. I'm so incredibly proud at how this agency not only faced a crisis, but thrived in that crisis. And now that we've settled into the new normal, we're revamping some of our aspects of our organization so that we can better serve our markets and the American people. We recently announced the reorganization of the agency and some additions to our executive team. One of the most exciting changes is the creation of a new division of data. This division pulls together parts of the agency that take in and analyze all the market data that we rely on to do our jobs, and many of you in the audience provide to us. This will allow the agency to better identify the data that we need and work better with you, our market participants and exchanges, to receive that data. We're also reallocating some of our examiners from DSIO to DCR to better support our clearinghouse exams. We're also moving our customer education team into DSIO, which will be rebranded as the Division of Market Participants. All these changes will help rationalize and streamline our agency's operations and help us better fulfill our oversight roles. So how were we so successful in just 15 months? Well, the answer is I've got a lot of people to thank. After all, personnel is policy. Along with the dedicated career staff at our agency, we've attracted a diverse team of the best and brightest to help me lead this agency. So what will we say were the keys of success? You know, looking back at my time thus far at the CFTC, there have been some overarching objectives and some guiding principles. One of the primary objective of my tenure, one of them, has been to complete the Dodd-Frank rules. We're 12 years since the financial crisis and 10 years since the Dodd-Frank Act. With the completion of swap dealer capital rules and position limits, we finalized all the major rules required by Dodd-Frank. And with the revisions of the swap data reporting rules, we fixed one of the most problematic rules from the initial flurry of the Dodd-Frank rules. Now, as I said before, the Dodd-Frank rules aren't necessarily set in stone. I'm saying that we finished building the regulatory framework that Dodd-Frank outlined. And with that objective accomplished, another is to help the agency and the industry rewrite its future. The emphasis on promoting responsible innovation, I believe, is grounded in three things. Number one, a focus on engagement with domestic and international regulators. Number two, the renewed emphasis on principles-based regulation. And third, a recognition of the important role of self-regulatory organizations. And I believe all of these three things are key to having this industry thrive in the future. And all of these point that the CFTC will be able to adapt to changing markets and truly be the global standard when it comes to sound derivatives regulation. So when I think about my time thus far at the CFTC, I want to thank my fellow commissioners in particular. As a commission, we've been focused on policy, not politics or personality. Washington may be divided, and in fact, the nation may be divided, but the commission's tradition of collegiality and bipartisanship has never been broken. In fact, of the 30 final rules and the 21 proposed rules advanced by the commission under my tenure thus far, 84% were on a bipartisan basis, and 80% were actually unanimously. So I'm proud to call Commissioners Quintens, Benham, Stump, and Berkovitz not just my colleagues, but my friends. And in those few votes that weren't bipartisan, my fellow commissioners and I were able to still work together in a spirit of collegiality that is the hallmark of the CFTC. I also want to thank my personal office staff and our executive leadership team. I assembled a team of A players who got the job done. I'm proud to say that I also assembled one of the most diverse executive teams in the agency's history, and I've begun many internal efforts to celebrate and promote diversity at every level. We've also had incredible partners in Congress and in the administration. The National Economic Council, Chairman Clayton, Secretary Mnuchin, and in Congress, we've had champions on both sides of the aisle. In the Senate, Chairman Roberts and Ranking Member Stabenow. In the House, Chairman Peterson, Ranking Member Conaway, and Congressman Scott. I'd like to thank the bipartisan support from the House Agriculture Committee's leadership in particular in producing a CFTC reauthorization bill. Although that legislation hasn't yet moved out of the House, I'm hopeful that it sets a good foundation for congressional leadership looking forward. I'd also like to thank Senator Bozeman and Representative Scott, who were both incredibly helpful in showing a united front to our international colleagues as we addressed oversight regarding U.S. clearinghouses. And for the first time in my tenure, I saw appropriators in Congress fully fund the agency, and that has allowed us to achieve many of the things we've talked about today. And finally, and most importantly, I couldn't have done this without the support of my very patient wife and my two young sons, aged 6 and 9. Now, finally, you might think that after a historic run like this, we'd be resting on our laurels. It's a reasonable assumption, but you'd be wrong. We're going to continue to advance policy where practical. Next week, we'll finalize 2 more rules, swap execution facilities, and exempt DCO. In December, we'll have our last meeting of 2020 to finalize the first overhaul of the CFTC's bankruptcy rules in 37 years and our risk principles for electronic trading. Now, these last two were proposed with bipartisan support, and I think their final adoption should be non-controversial and welcome revisions to our existing regulations. So if I had to summarize the CFTC's activity in 5 words, it'd be this: promises made and promises kept. Or to follow the steak analogy from earlier, plenty of sizzle and a whole lot of steak. It's an honor to serve as the 14th chairman and CEO of the CFTC and to once again address all of you. FIA is such an incredible partner, and I want to again thank you, Walt, for your outstanding leadership and the invitation to speak today. Everyone, please stay safe and stay healthy. All the best. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm now very hungry after all those steak analogies, but I do want to thank you for appearing today at FIA Expo and want to publicly recognize your public service and your many accomplishments since taking the helm of the CFTC. I also want to thank, as you noted, the CFTC staff and the directors for all their hard work, and notably your family for allowing you to do this and to be a leader. I think the markets are better off because of your leadership and that of your staff. And the FIA membership thanks you. So with that, please stay tuned for an excellent lineup of speakers and panelists today at FIA Expo.